Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful morning. I am so pleased to be convening a small panel of guests today, 3 speakers from really very different perspectives, very different organizations and leadership positions, and they're going to be sharing with you what they see as emerging trends and innovations in international development, in particular in global food security, but in development more broadly, and really looking at it from the institutional, finance, and investment side. So I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Uma Lele. She's joining us virtually. She was going to be here, but due to an injury, she's joining us virtually, and we're so pleased to have you. Dr. Lele is president of the International Association of Agricultural Economists and the first woman to be awarded a PhD in applied economics at Cornell University.
Thank you.
At age 24. She has decades of experience in research operations, policy analysis, and evaluation. She was also the first woman to be elected to her position at the International Institute with its 92-year history, and she's responsible for planning the first all-virtual and the 31st International Conference on Agricultural Economists, which took place in 2021. Dr. Lele, we'll look forward to you telling us more about yourself. Let me introduce each of our panelists. Roger Voorhees. Roger is president for Global Growth and Opportunity, the division of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's a member of the executive leadership team, and he oversees agricultural development, financial services for the poor, global education, nutrition, and water, sanitation, and hygiene. Kind of a broad portfolio.
Sort of.
This program offers approximately $700 million in grants each year, awards of all types. In his role, Roger leads the foundation's efforts to combine policy change with science, technology, and business innovation. Roger, welcome to the stage. We'll have you tell us more about your work in a moment.
Thanks, Barbara. Yeah.
And finally, we have Eric Dankwa. Dr. Dankwa is professor of plant genetics at the University of Ghana, just coming here from Africa a little bit ago. He's recipient of the university's Distinguished Award for Meritorious Service in 2013. He's a 2018 laureate for the World Agriculture Prize and the 2022 Africa Food Prize recipient. Eric received this award in Rwanda last month, and I was there. We had the chance to meet. So he's founding director of the West Africa Center for Crop Improvement, which was established in 2007 to train a new generation of plant breeders to develop improved varieties of staple crops throughout West and Central Africa. Eric, we're so grateful you're here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to start our session by having each of you just say for a couple of minutes, in addition to this illustrious background that each of you have, and what is it that you're most focused on at this time? And we'll start with you, Uma, if you don't mind. Just 1 or 2 minutes. What's occupying you right now? Can you hear me okay, Uma?
I think I was being told that, can you see me?
We can see you well. We can see you well. You can speak up a little bit if you'd like. We can hear you well.
Okay, I can speak up a little. So there isn't really much that I can tell you after that long introduction. The only thing is that I was hoping to retire, quote unquote, from the World Bank, and I've ended up doing so. One of my challenges is hard to retire. So that's that's my ambition. That's all I can say. But everything I'm doing is very challenging, including participating in this. I used to work with Norman Borlaug many years, so a real honor to be included here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I think we're all going to do everything we can to prevent you from retiring. A little bit more from you, Roger.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara, for the introduction. It's good to be here. Uma, nice to see you virtually. Eric, it's always good to share the stage with you. But I actually oversee a lot of our agricultural work at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and our nutrition work. And it's really driven by this strong belief that one of the biggest drivers of people out of poverty has been agricultural transformation. And we've seen this incredible optimistic view over the last 30, 40 years of the greatest number of people coming out of poverty in the history of the world. And yet, in the last several years, as we've seen from the current SOFI report and as we've seen from the growing levels of food insecurity moving from 150 to 350 million people, that we actually are not making that progress anymore. And especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where we've not seen the kind of poverty reduction. And if I look back historically, we really believe that this is probably one of the most important engines of productivity and economic development, but also food security and nutrition in the world, is what happens with global agriculture. And how do we do that in the face of climate change? So for me, having spent most of my career in sub-Saharan Africa and Malawi and Zambia and seeing what it looks like in the Malawi famine, I'm really worried. I'm worried about how we move from a culture, and as we heard from Samantha Power the other day, on how much is going into aid and how we actually shift our contributions into development. I'm worried that we're not putting enough into R&D in driving the kinds of changes that we've seen in the world historically in terms of crop productivity and soil health. And then how do we do that sustainably in the face of climate change? And I think that the people in this room created a revolution between the 1960s and the 2000s of overcoming what we all thought was going to be a huge world food insecure crisis. And how do we do that again for our friends in sub-Saharan Africa? And we partner with our African friends and let them lead in this development. And so I'm excited to be here, and thanks for the chance.
Absolutely, pleasure. Eric, we'll go to the first question in a moment, but tell us a little bit more about what you're doing right now.
Thanks, Barbara. Let me thank you for the opportunity to sit on this panel with Roja and Uma. It's a great privilege to be here. I'm so humbled. I can recognize Ronnie Kaufman in the audience. I would say that, look, I'm happy that Roja is worried. I believe that today we are going to change the model for looking at R&D for impact. I'm a product of many positive influences across the world. Had my education in the UK after my first degree in Ghana. And in between my master's and PhD at Cambridge, I went back to Ghana for 2 years. And when I returned to Ghana after my PhD in sciences that could take me anywhere in the world, some people were quite surprised. But I went to Ghana for a purpose. I'm unhappy when I see children cry on the street. And quite recently, during the lockdown in Accra, there was this commercial bus driver who was stopped. His vehicle was impounded, and he got out and screamed, "My wife and kids are hungry at home. I better die of COVID-19." We get troubled, and I believe that this conversation will allow us to think and fix Africa once and for all. Because if we are not careful about the approach we use, the model we use, come 2030, we'll sit here and be saying the same things. And I'm so delighted that Roja is worried.
Well, clearly, we do not want to be having the same conversation coming back to this stage in that regard. So thank you for sharing that story.
Thank you.
So in this time where global food security is at the absolute forefront of our thinking, of our planning, the concern and focus, thank goodness, unfortunately, it's at the forefront again globally. What are some of the perspectives that you all can offer us regarding this looming crisis? What are the innovations in development that are emerging in the time of the triple Cs that we can utilize and advance going forward? Why don't we first turn to Uma.
Oh, do you want me to say something first?
No, that's Roja.
No, I think, let me see, I've gotten,
I think it was
this didn't go up.
Roger.
It needs to go up.
No trouble. Happy for Uma to start.
Yeah, no.
Okay. So, I just last year finished this book, Food for All, and it's an experience of 5 major international organizations, the World FAO, CGIAR, WFP, and can't remember, IFAD. And I think looking at them historically, what is striking is that when the global food crisis first in 1975, 72 to 75, when CGIR was formed, there were many initiatives that the international community undertook in response to that crisis. And now what I'm seeing, that there is a certain amount of feeling of being jaded. You know, crises come and crises go and nothing much. So I really think that it behooves both developing countries and the international institutions to invest a lot more in food and agriculture than they are doing currently. I think that's, in a way, my central message. Gross underinvestment in food and agriculture, despite the fact that we are having recurring crises. And if we take into account change, for instance, 100 billion are supposed to be invested, only 30 billion have been pledged so far. So the gap between what is needed to invest in food and agriculture and related sectors, education, health, etc., climate change, and the amount of resources that are available are very small. So at the end of our session, I have some suggestions on what should happen in the international community about it.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you. Roger, I'm sure you can build on that.
Look, I think that it's great to build on what Uma says, especially about the creation of the CGIAR. As you talked about, I get to span a lot of different development programs within the foundation. And if we look at the global architecture, if we didn't have a CGIAR today, we would be building one. And yet we have it as this legacy of impressive changes around the world since the 70s. And the question I would say, and to build on Uma, is we are underinvesting in agricultural R&D that's necessary to drive the new crop varietals that we're going to need in the face of climate change. So there was an interesting study that was put out a couple of years ago that actually said climate change is not, especially in tropical regions, a future problem, but is actually the headwinds are already delaying productivity by up to 30%, maybe 34%, if I remember the paper. So we're already experiencing it, but it's not, the people who are on the front lines of that are small-scale producers, smallholder farmers, who had almost nothing to do with contribution to climate change. So I think one, as Uma said, the world is underinvested in R&D. Two, we're underinvested in the people that drive this change on the ground, so new systems. And three is infrastructure. And we need to actually invest and have countries invest in the kind of policy that needs to happen. But it also needs to shift our focus away from responding to the crises, which you can go to 2002, 2008, 2009, now we're in 2022. There'll probably be another one 8 to 9 years from now. And we're spending, I think this year, $5.7 billion on food aid, plus food subsidies of something around $50 billion. We should be able to put a fraction of that, which is less than $9 billion already, in research and development, but two, in investing in young scientists, young entrepreneurs, and the infrastructure that's needed. One example that we cite is digital. You can now do extension services for a fraction of the price, a few dollars per reaching an individual versus $100 previously. And so I think, or even soil mapping, which has gone down 97%. So we have the tools, we need to up our investment and we need to deploy them. And it's where partnerships with Eric and Uma and others, I think, are important to the foundation, and investing in local entities.
So really tremendous points, and important to hear the analogy of the headwinds of climate change. And if that's the case, we must be approaching the storm, if not in the storm now of it, and investing in farmers, infrastructure. We certainly see the foundation doing that, but also in order to avoid further crises and get ahead of the crises, taking advantage of the digital services and other, where you see those shifts in price changes and investments possible. So, Eric, what would you say in regard?
Thanks, Barbara, and good to hear from Uma and Roger on this issue. I think what I would say is first, COVID-19 has taught us important lessons. Of course, we know in the world that it's an instance in time which is not going to be existential. That is something we have to note. But we shouldn't also forget that there could be a future pandemic which will be very devastating. Now, what does this tell us? If we don't innovate in Africa for production at consumption points, perhaps we'll be hungry forever, and we cannot wait for planes to arrive from France to deliver seeds to African farmers. So there should be more innovation in Africa for Africa, and I think that is what brings me to my next point. I'm delighted that the 1CGIAR is now focused, bringing on board the research and innovation strategy. How we situate universities in Africa in the entire global research agenda will be very crucial in our attaining our aims and objectives. If we fail to do that, perhaps we will have to come back and see how we bring the investors on board. I'm saying this because today, most of the innovations that are helping farmers locally in Africa, in Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Ghana, are resilient varieties developed by our own products, not from anywhere outside Africa. And I think it's going to be more important in the future. You look at what we have done at the West Africa Center for Crop Improvement, 105 PhDs over the past few years. And I think globally, in the last decade, I do not find any university in the global north which has turned out 105 PhDs in plant breeding. And Roger, these students are working today in 15 countries. They have released over 200 varieties, which are game-changing products. Some are productive, resilient, and nutritious. In Burkina Faso, if you went to Burkina Faso, Somi Kusao has released sweet potato varieties that every farmer in Burkina Faso is using. You come to Ghana, we have rice products, new rice products developed from our alumnus, which is giving us 4 tons per hectare. Unfortunately, it's not gone into the public domain because of policy challenges. The varieties that we are using in Ghana in rice now give us an average 2.8 tons per hectare. It's not going to work. We need new products developed in Africa for Africa on the markets. If you went to Vietnam, they get 5.8 tons per hectare. Why can't we do that in Africa? It has to be R&D and delivery mechanisms that allow us to get to farmers in real time. And I would say that it is only strategic partnerships, serious investments. Universities are where you find a critical mass of scientists. And I tell you, they are the people who will be in the forefront of the fight in collaboration with the CGIAR, the private sector, and all partners to chart a new pathway that will ensure that in the next 5, 6, 7 years, we can get food on every table in every home in Africa.
I love that duration, in the next 5 to 7 years. That puts us there by 2030. So investing and innovating in Africa for Africa. We're later on going to have Akin Adesina, the president of African Development Bank, will have a broadcast for us for 15 minutes. And his moniker is always Africa feeding itself. And it's wonderful to hear some of your examples here where Africa is feeding itself and using from products developed, sweet potato rice in country, resilient products for Africa. So thank you. So let's go to our next question and try to understand a little bit more about institutional change, both the multilateral change that's necessary, countries, philanthropic development in finance, in credit for women. How does I don't know, I'm having this mental space. unfortunately, that's not the question where we should be. So I'm going to go back, rewind for the next 30 seconds, and we're going to come back to you and stick with you, Eric, and stick with the next question. Okay, so where we're going to go is on research and development, and really talk more about research and education in food and agriculture. So what we're learning about the shifts and changes that are needed in Africa is tremendous on the continent. Just talk to us about a little bit more about where you even just started. Where do we need to go in the future in that, particularly investment in education?
Thank you, Barbara. For close to 5 decades, Africa did not have the capacity to utilize its own genetic resources to develop new products. And we missed the Green Revolution of the 1960s because, of course, the political climate and the ecological conditions were not conducive. In the 1970s, you find the CGIAR come into place, and they've done a lot. I would say if it had not been created by the foundations today, I don't know where Africa would be. So we give high praise to the CGIAR for the innovations that have come out of their work. But we noticed that for close to 30 years, the Bretton Woods institutions encouraged Africa to deprioritize tertiary education. That was a major challenge in Africa. So you found African smart students exiting Africa, studying abroad in all the best universities in the world. Myself, I was a product of Cambridge University. But you find that over 80 to 90% of students at the time did not come back. Mm-hmm. In fact, when in 1994, I returned to Ghana with my PhD, you could hardly find capacity in plant breeding innovation in Ghana. Most of the people were over 50, 60 years with no expertise in modern technologies to develop new varieties. And so I had to think. And fortunately for me, I had won a World Bank grant. I was PI of, and together with a colleague, we went to Cornell University and met Ronnie Kaufman. And I said to Ronnie, we have to change Africa. And we needed to put in place a postgraduate program that could stand its own anywhere in the world. And we were so delighted. And it's good when you meet game changers. We could see into the future that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller were going to invest in a new organization called the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And I give AGRA the high praise for the smart investments in us to found the West Africa Center for Crop Improvement. Fast forward 15 years, what we have done in Africa, for me, has not been done in most universities globally in the area of plant breeding innovation. Barbara, I think the way forward has to do with how we can harness the human capacity globally to ensure that instruction is harmonized. So that when you walk out of graduate school in Ghana or Uganda or Tanzania or Nigeria, you can speak like someone who is walking out of Purdue or Cornell or Iowa State or Michigan State. How do we do that? We can do it. We have shown at the West Africa Center for Crop Improvement that we can do that, ensuring that we include, if you like, all of the CGIAR institutions in our work. So a new model for delivering quality plant breeding education. Let me say, together with Iowa State, for example, I got my young faculty to develop online instruction manual for the plant breeding Africa education online program. And so you find that my early career scientists are now champions in online delivery of plant breeding education. I think that is instructive. And I believe that this is what foundations like the Rockefeller, the Gates, etc., and African governments themselves, because I've been hitting hard at African governments, that, you see, we see America today because of the land grant universities, and your land grant act has benefited all of you. Why can't we have an act in Ghana which obligates us to put our tertiary institutions first? Because you see, oftentimes, and I don't want to even talk about the youth now, because you see, agribusinesses cannot flourish where there is no innovation. And where is the innovation going to come from? It's going to come from the universities. And so first, fix the universities in Africa like Cornell, like Yale, and I'm calling on African governments to do this with us, for Africa. Once we have done that, I believe that everything will be a matter of time. So I'm calling for a new model for instruction in Africa. We should, and of course, if you have read the reports of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, 2009-2013, it was instructive that centers like WACI must be strengthened and replicated across Africa and Southeast Asia. This is there for everyone to see. So I believe, Barbara, we should begin thinking about how we can work together. And I know that the one CGIAR provides a platform. Nonetheless, they must be talking now. The NARIS and the CGIAR are talking. I want to see African universities properly situated in the middle of the conversation.
Yes.
Because we are the front, we are the center
Yes.
of the innovations that is going to come.
And so great to have you paint that history of how it has progressed and how it's proceeded, but where that investment now really needs to be. The universities need to be African universities at the seat, at the table, at the core, and to honestly know that maybe the reverse of the brain drain is starting to happen. I think it was coined in Africa. So Uma, other comments that you have, Roger, on the investment in research and development, and particularly in education?
You know, I think if you take the example of the Green Revolution, when Norman Borlaug had these high-yielding varieties of wheat and rice, he really championed with the World Bank and McNamara to say you must invest a lot more in India's own capacity for universities and scientists, etc. And at that time, huge amount of investment was made in India to make sure that the Green Revolution did not just stay in small areas, but it was multiplied in larger cases with partnerships with US universities. I think in a meeting we had organized a few years ago, we found that the capacity of US universities to contribute in a way that they did before has diminished because the gap between the science that land-grant universities are practicing in developed countries and the capacity of developing countries has increased greatly. And so if the World Bank wants to invest more in universities, it doesn't have the same kind of complementary investments and expertise coming from American universities as it did once upon a time. So I think if our interest is in building capacity in developing countries, we must think much more fundamentally about what is needed to create that capacity in advanced countries to help developing countries and give them incentives to make sure that they get rewarded for their good performance in helping build capacity. And I think that kind of spirit has vanished. I hate to say this, but that spirit doesn't exist anymore. So I think we need to think much more creatively about the partnerships between bilateral donors like USAID, bilateral institutions, universities, and developing countries. We did develop an initiative called the Green Initiative some 10 years ago. And the idea was to create financing for this initiative so that three-way partnerships could be developed. Unfortunately, we didn't have much success in raising resources for it. So I think if we are serious about investments in developing countries, we have to think much more fundamentally. And institutions like the Gates Foundation can help us a lot in thinking about what it means to create capacity.
I mean, we would definitely agree with the importance of investing in researchers, in investing in NAR systems, and actually making sure that the cutting edge research and development gets applied not just to big commercial crops, but also crops that matter to low income and smallholder farmers around the world. Added to that, I want to make a special emphasis of where we think there's a gender gap in this area. We've seen that gender gap grow. over the last few years, both in food insecurity, but also in access to resources. I think the latest numbers are, we are hoping to close the gender gap in some big areas by 2030, according to the SDGs. I think we're now up to 2,100, so we're going to be way later. How do we actually do that and show that that can happen in sub-Saharan Africa? But I think it's more, I sort of think about this as a development stack, and it's more than just the investment in the research side. It's kind of 4 layers for me. One is, what are the right policies in developing countries and in rich countries that are going to actually support investments in research and development, in talent, and in infrastructure that's going to help create productivity increases. And that intensification has to be part of this problem. Otherwise, our goals to preserve forests, our goals to preserve grasslands won't happen, because with a growing population in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia, we'll simply have extensification. So the first layer is, let's get the policy environment right, and we need policy leaders to stick with this for more than just a couple years. The second is infrastructure, and I think investment in people is a huge piece of that. We do that through AGRA, through the CGIAR, through NARS, and even in terms of leadership development for things like we've invested in award programs for young women scientists in One Planet. For Mwanza is also another program for young women scientists. And so how do we get the right infrastructure in place? But that's also physical infrastructure. And that's infrastructure around places for silos, roads that go to smallholder farmers. Transport costs are, Eric and I were talking backstage. I mean, if you live in Zambia or Malawi, your transport costs to get something to market are massive. And so how do we address that? And then the last one is technological innovation. And we have new tools in genetic engineering that all of you are really familiar with, new tools in analyzing soil health, new digital tools for extension services, but also from genotype to phenotype predictability. And all of that is about trying to cut breeding time, new varietal release time. But we've also need, finally, the behavior change on the ground. Our smallholder farmers still lack access to capital. Average age of varietals, both in parts of Asia and parts of Africa, can be 20 years old. How do we actually get the delivery systems to work? And yet we know these answers. We've been successful. The people in this room created the revolution we saw in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Can we apply that in the countries that haven't fully experienced that yet? And I think we can. But we're going to have to invest in those layers of that architecture.
Tremendous to hear the stack. It's very, very helpful. Well, let's just take a couple of minutes to elaborate a little bit further on investments, institutional change, and what's needed, particularly for women and youth. And I know, Uma, you've focused so much of your career and most recently on it. What are some of your thoughts?
You know, I recently published a paper on India. I was surprised to see that women's labor force participation is not only low in India compared to Southeast Asian countries, but it's declining over time. I mean, talk about progress. I was surprised to see that it's declining. And I think it's partly related to the socio-political factors, which seem to lead to decline in women's labor force participation. I think it is something which requires much more research, even as somebody who had a very progressive father and believed in getting me educated and making sure that I was doing as well as my brother. There aren't many forward-looking progressive parents who are doing what my father did 50 years ago. So I think we really need to think about women's labor force participation. The fact that it's declining is an indication of the fact that overall the country may be doing better, but not as well as it should be doing. So one issue is investment in women's education, starting from primary education, better access to land, better access to credit, etc. In general, improving the capacity of women to participate more effectively. We have reports from FAO, etc., but we haven't really translated them in actual practice on a country by country basis as we need to do.
And
The
Uma, you
second-
have, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, the second thing is, I think there has been a lot of investment in human capital in Africa, in land-grant universities, but the brain drain is substantial, as our colleague was pointing out. And we must find ways to stop that brain drain and create more incentives within Africa for the scientists in Africa to be more productive. Asian countries had such initiatives. You know, they had resources which were provided for Asian scientists to remain in their countries and be productive. And I think we need to find creative solutions to make sure that we not only train more people, but retain them in their own countries.
Train and retain. Uma, you have some really great examples of some of the investments that have been so fruitful in particular countries. Do you just want to paint one picture for us?
Investments in, well, I mean, the Green Revolution was an amazing example of what can happen, right? But I think what is disconcerting, if you look at it over time, in a way, because of that success of the Green Revolution, then people began to sit on their laurels and not really think about rejuvenation of the research systems in South Asia to make sure that they remain as productive as they are. And if I can give an example, I must say I'm very impressed by what Bangladesh is doing. You know, I compared some numbers on women's labor force participation in Bangladesh and India. And when Bangladesh was created in 1972, nobody thought Bangladesh was going to be such a progressive country that's growing rapidly with much more role for women than is the case in India, despite the fact that India has huge amount of infrastructure in these community organizations that India has created, something patterned after Seva. And if we invest a lot more in those women's organizations in India in the same way that the Bangladeshis have done, we could progress much more rapidly. And of course, there is a lot to do in Africa on building institutional capacity with women playing a much more active role at the local level, local government level, and state level than is the case currently. So lots of cross-country examples of successes from which others can learn.
Thank you, thank you. Your thoughts?
Okay, thanks, Barbara. A couple of days ago, I was in DC for 2 days, and David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, said that the World Bank has spent about $600 million to establish 70 centers of excellence in Africa across 35 universities. And all center leaders met in DC, and if you saw the outputs and outcomes of the work of African centers of excellence, you marvel. The problem has to do with investments for agriculture, the seed systems, and the value chains. If we did that, opportunities will come for women and the youth. At the West Africa Center for Crop Improvement, we have created an enterprise hub for ag innovation named after Kofi Annan, and that is the Kofi Annan Enterprise Hub for Agricultural Innovation. We partnered with MIT, Massachusetts, and then rolled out an entrepreneurship program before COVID. Some of the students that we trained have become game changers in Ghana, creating opportunities, farming, and getting people, hire them to teach them how to farm. It's all about education, education, education. But if the strong educational institutions don't have the facilities, how can they train? I once told a Japanese delegation that, look, you want to see the future of Ghana? Walk to all the public institutions and look at their schools of agriculture. That is the future of Africa. Until we change the paradigm, serious change about investments in educational institutions to create opportunities for women and the youth, there is no way forward, Barbara. I believe that at the West Africa Center for Crop Improvement, we now have about 36% of our students female. We have to go up a bit. We are working hard at that. We are working with award. And I believe that it's only a question of time. And when we are strengthened and expanded, and of course, I believe I'll have another minute later on, we are calling for something different that will cost Africa. Because, like you gave some numbers, the billions of dollars, Ghana spends, last year, Ghana spent $2.7 billion to import food and raw materials for the food industry. It's ridiculous. We have to put 1% of GDP. Our GDP is about $75 to $80 billion. We can't put 1% into R&D for development. We can't. But I think our development partners have to find ways of obligating African governments to do what they have to do. For example, Roger, I've sat on advisory committees of some projects, and I find that some foundations have rolled out some development projects in selected countries, but they have not really engaged the leadership of the countries to ensure that there is a contribution. And without that, projects will not be sustainable. So I'm calling for a new model. When you find that there are institutions doing great, look for them, pick them, use them, and advance the cause of Africa. I believe there's so much we can do, and we will fix women and children if universities are fixed.
And, I mean, one of the things I get to do in my job is travel around the world. And spent, as I said, most of my professional career outside the U.S. before I joined the foundation. And one of the things I try and do in this country is meet young entrepreneurs. And we recently had a meeting with some entrepreneurs right before the UN General Assembly, and we heard a number of things from women in both Asia and in Africa around what they need. And education is a piece of that, right? The education gap is significant. Yeah. But there are also other things that are really foundational that make a big difference, we've seen. One is just actually access to an ID. There's the program within the World Bank of the ID for D.
Right.
And all of us in this room, are often worried about our being overknown and our privacy. But if you are a low-income person in the developing world, and if you are a woman in the developing world without an ID, you are underknown. And it is super expensive to be poor. They pay more for everything out of that unknowingness. And so we've invested, and other donors and countries have invested to try and actually create an open source ID platform that countries can implement through the ID for D at the World Bank. And we've seen that and modeled off of Adahar in India and others. And the impact we heard from these young entrepreneurs for just access to government services, access to policies that are support that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, or not even have to go through their male counterparts to be introduced and to be identified, I think is important. The second is financial access. Financial inclusion has been a consistent gender gap. The last Findex report, which just came out in the spring meetings, has shown for the first time that gender gap is closing, and it's closing because of mobile money. And it's closing because mobile money is able to sign up remotely. You can do it from your house. You don't have to have permission. There are tiered KYCs, and that brings access to financial services. And that's not just credit, but access to be able to save your proceeds from your harvest, to hold that one season to the next, has shown after RCT, tremendous benefit at the household level. Because a woman who controls not just access to resources, but control of those resources can be a partner in making those decisions. And so I think there's an education component, certainly, but there's also a clear infrastructure and core access component. And then I think that we still have a productivity gap in women in agriculture. And that productivity gap really comes from having to guard their land, not having access to the resources they need, and then not actually having to the markets that they need. And I think that we know how to solve that, and we need to address it. And that starts with donors being gender intentional in the grants we make, and responding to what we hear from our leaders in Africa and Asia of what they want.
Good, good.
Thank you. Thank you for highlighting that. We've been trying to talk about women and youth throughout the week and make sure we spend some time on it in most of the panels. So gender intentional investment sounds like maybe a bit of a new phrase and really appropriate. We're going to give each of you just 1 minute for a last word, and then we're going to take a break. So Uma, what would be your charge, call to action, just a short minute on what you think we should be taking out of this from you?
I think substantial expansion of the international system. The 5 organizations I've talked about, World Bank, FAO, CGIAR, WFP, and IFAD. Among those, WFP has been the growth industry. And it is because there is such demand for emergency assistance that most of the donor money, as Samantha Power correctly pointed out, is going into emergency assistance. So and even then, despite the innovations of WFP, there isn't enough money for WFP to meet all the demand that there is on it. So that money, in some ways, is a substitute for not investing enough in research and development in countries. So conflicts are increasing, and particularly in the context of climate change, conflicts are increasing even more. So I think we need to think about these 5 organizations as the basics infrastructure, global infrastructure, and how can we support them more with more resources, more capacity, so that they are much more responsive to the growing needs of the international community, which we've talked about a lot today. There is no disagreement on what the magnitude of the problem is, but the amount of resources to deal with the magnitude of the problem is nowhere near what is needed in order to deal with it. So that's my basic message.
Thank you. Thank you so much, the 5 organizations. Just 1 minute, quick last call to action.
I mean, for me, in my lifetime, I'll be 60 soon, we've seen 2 big waves of poverty reduction in the world. In China and North Asia, South Asia, and they have been radical to change low-income people's lives, and small-scale producers and farmers were at the forefront of that. I think we have the possibility of doing that for a third with our partnership in sub-Saharan Africa and in the parts of Asia that have not experienced that. And so I would love to see us partner, and that requires an investment in development and not just aid. I mean, frankly, most of my friends in that part of the world and leaders I talk to are not looking for a handout. They're looking for a structure that works for them, and they're looking for a hand up to invest in the right kinds of areas. And so we stand ready to do our small part to partner with that, and we stand ready to be in the background because the real leaders are people like Eric, people like Uma, and others who are on the front lines of this. So thanks, Barbara.
Thank you. Eric, last word.
Barbara, 105 PhDs have released over 200 varieties, have published over 250 high-impact journal articles, and have, more important, attracted over $57 million into their research program for development projects, much more than we have spent on them, the value of quality plant breeding education. I'm thinking about how we stop the exit of African students from Africa to the global north to train, and we're losing 80% of them. African universities need endowments, and the Africans must pay for it and could be supported by the global north. Without endowments, which will make us as strong as the Cornells and the Purdues and the Iowa States, there's no way we'll move forward. Thank you.
I actually think the data shows that for every $1 invested in R&D research,
10 plus.
10 plus.
10 plus, that's correct, yeah. 10
exactly.
Plus, yeah.
We'll hang on to that figure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your perspectives, for all your time and preparation, and thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.